Good morning, everyone. Today we are going to go through the previous class about fertilization and pollination, and here I'm going to summarize few basic things that happens in fertilization. The first thing that we need to know is what is pollination. It is the transfer of pollen from anther to stigma. So here what happens is, before fertilization, pollination happens, and pollination is a sequence where pollen grains, which are the male sex cells, they transfer or they get released and they fall on stigma, and there fertilization takes place. And fertilization is the fusion of male and female gametes. So, what do we know about gametes? Gametes are the cells that are produced by the reproductive organs of an organism, which can be termed as a male gamete or a female gamete in the respective organism, which are male and female. And these sex cells, or known as gametes, are only found in bisexual organisms, such as a flower. There's pollination. So pollination is of two types. Number one is self-pollination. The other is known as xenogamy or cross-pollination. So pollination, as we know, it is the transfer of pollen from anther to stigma, and it is of two types. One is self-pollination, the other is cross-pollination. So self-pollination is in itself when the flower is pollinating or the pollens are transferring in the same flower, and it is of two types also. The first is known as autogamy, the other is known as gatonogamy. So autogamy happens only where? It happens only in the same flower. Suppose you have a flower and pollination is to take place, then what will happen is that if the pollen grains fall from the same flower inside the same flower, then it is known as autogamy. But if it is taking place in between the different flowers of the same plant, then it will be known as gatonogamy. And this comes in self-pollination. Now we'll see cross-pollination. We know what is self-pollination. It is of two types. One is autogamy, the other is gatonogamy. So in autogamy, the pollen grains fall from same flower inside from the anther to stigma. But when the pollen grains of the same plant from this anther falls on a different flower, then it is known as gatonogamy. But there is another type of pollination that takes place, which is known as cross-pollination or xenogamy. And xenogamy is known as when pollination happens between different plants of the same species. So sometimes you have learned this, and it happens that you have a plant which is flowering, and an insect comes and sits on that flower. So that insect also carries pollen grains, and those pollen grains can fertilize the same flower. Because we know that fertilization is the fusion of male and female gametes. So pollen grains are known as male gamete, and inside the ovary of the flower, in the embryo sac, the ovules which are present are known as female gamete. So this cross-pollination happens by two different factors. One is known as biotic factor, the other is abiotic factor. And biotic factors have those agents which are are biological beings such as birds, bats, snails, and insects. And abiotic factors, which are not the biological beings or which are not the living things, such as wind and water, is known as abiotic factors of pollination. So, but these things, these terms are known different in your biology books. Because if birds are pollinating a flower, then it will be known as ornithophilia. So birds, if they are the biotic components and they are doing cross-pollination, are known as ornithophilia. And in bats, it's known as chiropterophilia. And in snails, it is known as malacophilia. In insects, it's known as actinomophilia. And the biotic agents, which are anemophilia, is known to be the wind carrier, and hydrophilia, the water. These phili, the word phili that comes, these are, it is a type of phenomenon, or you can say the phenomenon of pollination which is taking place by these biotic and abiotic factors. Now, once this happens, once the fertilization, once the pollination happens, then fertilization begins. And there are a series of steps in fertilization, how fertilization is taking place. But in flowers, fertilization to happen, pollination has to happen. And in fertilization, the first thing that it includes is, when fertilization is going to happen, is pollen grains, they fall on the stigma, which is the pollination. And those same pollen grains which will be falling on the stigma or are there, they start to germinate. And when they start to germinate, they form a pollen tube. And that pollen tube reaches down to the style and it goes to the embryo sac. Then when it reaches the embryo sac, there inside the embryo sac are present the eggs or the egg cell, which are known as ovules, and they fertilize by two polar nuclei. And this is how fertilization takes place. So you can look at this once again, how it's happening, and keep this flow chart in mind, because this is very helpful and this is going to create a memory inside your brains, and you will remember this. Because in this chapter, pollination and fertilization, it is the starting. After this, we are going to cover how the seed is formed, because it is the end result of fertilization. The first thing, when we see a seed, it grows, and in order to see how that seed is formed, we have to go through pollination. Then when pollination happens, the same pollen grains germinate and they fertilize the cell, and that cell, the ovary itself, it will grow and a zygote will form, then an embryo will form, and finally it will keep on dividing until it forms a seed. Now I will show you a picture which will help you to understand how this pollen grain is growing. And as you can see in the picture, that a pollen grain in part A, B, C, D and E, that how this germ pore will develop and the two male sex cells are there in the pollen tube. And the second image that I'm showing to you, it indicates the fertilization. The haploid stages are in blue, are in red, and the diploid stages are in blue, as you can see the whole process of fertilization. I hope you have understood this topic well. In next video we are going to see how a seed is formed. Thank you so much and have a nice day.